A few days ago, I have finished my first in-depth exploration of a Kubernetes component. As you can see in this diagram, a cluster is composed of multiple components, and the one I have taken a look at is this one here, which is kube-api server. And in this video, I would like to share my first impressions on it, my first thoughts, and some additional understanding that I've got. First of all, I have to say that kube-api server isn't as scary as it seems, because in the beginning it seemed a bit scary to me, being at the center of this diagram and having so many arrows pointing to it and from it. From this, by the way, I have learned that kube-api server is a server from one point of view. For instance, if I want to interact with the cluster, then I'm the client and this component here is the server. But kube-api server can also be a client if we consider that it communicates with etcd, which is the database. Then in this situation, kube-api server is actually a client and etcd is the server. I have learned that they communicate via gRPC, which is something that I've only heard of, but I haven't actually used, but that was just a side note. So this was it, one first thought, which is that kube-api server can be a client and a server depending on which perspective you choose. Then what I've also learned is that kube-api server is composed of some other little servers. I mean, not so little, but the kube-api server component has some subcomponents, and for that I have sketched a little diagram. So this one here is some replica of this one, and here I've taken aside kube-api server and I've made this diagram for it. What you see here is a chain of other servers that compose kube-api server. So after my first exploration, I have understood that there is actually a chain of independent servers with distinct responsibilities that compose kube-api server. So first of all, we have an aggregator server, which I don't know what it does. Then we have a control plane server, which this one is the one that I have gotten the most comprehensive understanding of compared to the other ones. This one is the one that is responsible for handling requests that concern Kubernetes resources, such as namespaces, such as pods, and other type of resources that Kubernetes has. So this one will have essentially a REST API of API groups, and these Kubernetes resources that I have mentioned earlier, they are they are grouped by groups because it makes sense for some of them. So for instance, you have the core group, which contains pods and other resources that I don't know of yet, but I know there are more than pods. And of course, there are other groups and so on. So there is one for authentication, for authorization, for deployments. Anyway, this part of the server is concerned with that. Then we also have the extension, the API extension server, which handles custom resource definitions or something like that, which I don't know yet what they are, but I know that this exists. And in the end, there is a part that handles the requests that haven't been assigned to any of these servers. So the way a request flows is that, first of all, it will reach this, let's say, the generic endpoint, yeah, and then the request will be forwarded to this chain of servers. First one will be aggregator server. Then if this server shouldn't handle this request, then it will pass the request to the delegated server. That's the keyword used in the source code, which kind of makes sense. And then this one will try to see if it can handle it. If it can, then it will do its logic and it will give a response. If this server cannot handle the request, it will forward that to the next one, and so on. So this was one other thing. To summarize, Kube API Server is composed of other independent servers with distinct responsibilities. And one last thing that I've learned is that there is so much I don't know. There are a lot of unknowns for me, not only about Kubernetes, but also about backend, about networking, about Go. I've learned about things like TCP multipath, which I don't know, which I hadn't heard of before. I've learned about Golang atomics. In some places, Kubernetes uses atomic value, atomic load, or atomic store, maybe. Anyway, there is this API of Golang that I haven't even heard of, not to mention using it. And there are others. There is so much that I don't know yet, and I'll have to make some additional explorations to discover even more unknowns. But that's the good part in learning, I guess. So this was my first impression of Kube API Server. Now I have to say that things make more sense. Of course, there is a lot more to learn. I will have to also review the tests. I guess I will understand a lot more about what this component and its subcomponents do by reading the tests, or even by debugging the tests. But until then, I will have maybe to do some other explorations. I'm very curious about how kubelet works, because from a first view, it seems to be like a container manager. I don't know, it seems very interesting, but I will see. And yeah, that was it for this video. Thank you, and I will see you in the next one.